Thank you so much, Douglas. Thank you everyone for being here. It is truly an honor and a delight to be talking a bit about birds and a bit about evolution to a society that's been thinking about natural history for over 230 years. And that is such an honor and a delight that I'm going to be opening, with the lights turning on, how exciting, that I'm going to be opening by making fun of British people just a little bit. And that is by why are we, hello, there we go, that slide, sure. Slides are mysterious. Making fun of British people just a little bit by pointing out that you folks really like talking about the weather, right? The weather here tends to be pretty much the same, tends to be a little bit cool, a little bit windy, a little bit rainy. And anytime it does something other than that, it's suddenly a giant topic of concern. And for birds, it's a little bit like that as well. Hello, why are the slides advancing? This is a little horrifying. Okay. Are we going to stay on this slide? Let's see. Slide roulette. Okay. So when birds are incubating their eggs, those eggs need to stay at a very constant temperature. That exact temperature is going to vary a little bit species by species, but for most species, that's going to be about 38 degrees Celsius. For any Americans in the room or online, that's about 100 degrees Fahrenheit. And if that temperature moves just a little bit, deviates just a little bit, that's suddenly a giant topic of concern, much like any amount of weather here in the UK. And if that amount of deviation happens for too long, it is bad news bears, where by bad news bears, I mean that that chick will not hatch. Now, will this slide advance? Hooray, the slide advanced. Okay. There are many ways that birds try to mitigate the effect of weather, especially extreme weather, on the eggs during the incubation phase to try to keep it at that nice stable temperature, which again is typically 38 degrees Celsius. And one of the sort of puzzling ways that we think they do it, but we're not sure, has to do with this structure right here, has to do with the nest. Now, most bird species build a nest, not all of them, and what a nest actually means to a bird will vary greatly. Given that you're voluntarily showing up to talk about nests, I assume you know something about nests, but just in case maybe you're in the wrong room, I will show you some of my favorites around the world. Gotta laugh, excellent. So to some birds, such as the social boll weaver here in South Africa, Namibia, and Botswana, a nest is a very giant communal structure with a whole bunch of different chambers and entrance tubes from the bottom leading up to those chambers. For birds like this one, this ruby-throated hummingbird here in North America, a nest is a cute little, very tiny little cup with the tiny little hummingbird eggs. Very regular in shape, very predictable between individuals. Or we can have something like this tailorbird here, common tailorbird found in South Asia and Southeast Asia, which also builds a cup, but then it stitches it into a leaf, and the leaf makes a nice little roof. Or something familiar to many people in this room here, we have the guillemot, known to some also as the common mirror, famous for their eggs, for being very pointy, symmetrical, also very pretty. Interesting patterns and colors, where nests for them are less about the actual structures themselves, which are very minimal, and more about the placing of these nests, right? They nest communally, often on cliffs, or, and this will be my last example, another favorite British bird, the great tit, Paris major. For any North Americans online, think chickadee. They also build a cup, but instead of like building a cup and sticking it on a tree somewhere, they tend to build those cups inside cavities, either cavities that they found naturally or these days often in nest boxes. So hopefully you get the idea that there are a bunch of different types of nests out there that vary greatly between species. And the question is, does this relate to the weather? Does this relate to the climate that the birds breed in? You can kind of look at these different types of nests and you can make up stories about how different types of nest structures might provide different amounts of protections from different climates, and how some might be more advantageous than others in different types of weather and different breeding conditions. But it's unclear if this is actually true. Right? And there are a bunch of different reasons for this sort of question mark here. And one of the major ones has to do with predation. There's about to be snakes. No one be alarmed. So there we go, slide advanced. So nests, in addition to, we think, protecting eggs and chicks from the weather, also protect eggs and chicks from predators, right? Being an egg is a very vulnerable time. Eggs can't fly away. They often get eaten during this phase. That in the lower left-hand corner is a monkey, by the way. Monkeys do eat eggs. And so if we're going to evaluate the relationship between nests and an environment, in an ideal world, we would also include something to do with predation. However, that is hard. That's so hard we have to have a question mark here. And that's hard for two main reasons. The first being that we actually know very little about nest predation for most birds. For exceptionally well monitored ones where we have, say, like a camera at a nest box, yeah, we can tell, okay, there's one fewer egg today because something went in and got it. But most species do not have that level of monitoring, and we just simply have no idea the level of predation that happens during the incubation stage. The second problem here is a bit of cause and effect problem, chicken and egg problem, if you were. And that's the idea that if we have a species over here that builds one type of nest, that's very high level of predation, species over here, different nest, low level of predation. We don't know if it's actually the difference in nest structures that cause that, right? Is this nest over here with the low predation such a good nest that that's deterred the predators? Or is that predator not targeting this species for some other reason? And it's actually this nest that's in some sort of co-evolutionary loop that's trying to protect from this predator, or something else going on entirely. We just can't distinguish that with the level of comparative data that we have available today, which again is very little. So sadly, we kind of have to leave it at that. Another major problem, though, in thinking about differences between species has less to do with cute pictures of foxes and more to do with mathematics. Luckily, though, this is a little bit solved, not completely, which is why this tick mark is yellow, but we have some idea of what to do about the fact that the maths get hard when thinking about problems like that. So to explain why the maths get hard, we need to think about evolutionary history a little bit. Imagine most people in this audience and online are used to thinking about evolutionary history as a tree of life. But the basic idea here is that bird species are going to be related more closely to some bird species than they are to some others, right? Sparrow is more closely related to other sparrows than to a tanager, more closely related to a tanager than to a toucan, more closely related to a toucan than to an ostrich, right? And we can represent those relationships graphically over time with something like this phylogenetic tree, which shows the our best guess as to where different branches speciated and what time that happened. And the reason we do that is because species are not independent. And this is a problem for the type of statistics we teach to first-year undergrads. Because when we teach statistics to first-year undergrads, we tell them with every single new type of test that your data must be independent, right? You learn a t-test, your data must be independent. Learn a linear regression, your data must be independent. And controlling for the non-independence of species, controlling for the fact that sparrows are more closely related to each other than they are to toucans, actually kind of a difficult problem. And to give you sort of an example of why that is, we can think about these two birds here. Now, I, being American, would call the bird on the right a hoary redpoll and the bird on the left a common redpoll. The Brits may call them something different, that's fine. Depending on who you ask, these are either two very closely related species or they are two subspecies of the same species, but they are at least different in some respect, and therefore you might have two different data points from these two different birds. But those two data points are not independent because the evolutionary history of these two redpoll, either species or subspecies, are actually mostly occurred on the same branch of evolutionary history for a very, very, very long time. And it's only recently, a little itty bit, that either the subspecies branched off or the two species branched off. And how do we represent that with first-year stats? Well, that's hard. So we have to turn to something else that's not first-year statistics. So we turn to something that's called phylogenetic comparative methods. So that takes phylogenies, so relationships, the evolutionary history of species, mostly determined these days by genetic data. They're sometimes from morphological data and sometimes from taxonomic constraints, things like that, saying that, okay, a sparrow is a sparrow. We borrow a little bit of mathematics from graph theory. So this is a branch of mathematics that thinks about structures where there are nodes and lines between nodes. Yes, that's exciting, I promise. We borrow from another branch of mathematics called linear algebra, which is about solving systems of linear equations or forcing things that aren't systems of linear equations and to look like linear equations because that's easier to solve than other things. And then we do a lot of computer programming about it. These days, mostly in the R statistical language, though you can program phylogenetic comparative methods in other language of your choice. And this is very much an area of active research, right? A tick mark there next to sort of the math symbols, but it was yellow. This is a very exciting time to think about phylogenetic comparative methods because actually we don't know the full evolutionary history of birds. This is paper published, this figure was taken from a paper published 2 months ago. And it's still very controversial, sort of what birds were doing over evolutionary time, particularly anything older than 60 million years ago or so. We also, once we have the phylogeny, don't have the mathematics fully solved. There's still lots of open questions there. And even if we did have a full phylogeny, which we don't, and even if we did have the mathematics fully solved, which we don't, there's still a question of, okay, what traits should we collect and what big evolutionary questions should we ask armed with these methods? Lots of open questions there. And that's kind of what I do as my day job. But anyway, all this bearing in mind now, we can return to this question of different types of nests and do they relate to the climate, right? And I can reassure you that it's not just me who asks questions like this. This question has been asked many times in the past 40 years or so, particularly in the past sort of 3 years. These are just the citations that could fit on my slide. There have been many, many more papers published on this topic. Apologies if any of those authors are in the audience, especially on Zoom. So people have looked at the relationship between nest type and climate in all sorts of ways, looking at it in songbirds, looking at it in birds of Australia, looking at it by making assumptions like, hey, what if all birds in a taxonomic family built the same type of nest, what would happen then? And they have gotten results all across the board, right? They have gotten all sorts of answers to the questions of, do nests relate to climate? Lots of question marks here. Just a few reasons I think why the field hasn't really converged on an answer yet. The first has to do with data availability. So this is the only known skin of the mysterious starling. Basically, this is a bird that was found on one of the Cook Islands where a Western scientist came, took one specimen, sailed off. And the next time any Western scientist came to that island, the bird had gone extinct. This skin is now at Tring. They let me measure it. It was a very exciting day. What kind of nest does a bird like this build? We have no idea. Literally what you see is all we know about this species. And even birds that are perfectly well alive and well today, we don't necessarily know what type of nests they build. We, in this case, being English-speaking Western scientists, because they often do so in secret in places that are rather inaccessible, and it is difficult to get natural history data from what the bird is doing into the hands of someone like me. We also have the opposite problem sometimes. So this is the Australian crake. And this buddy is kind of a pickle because this buddy will build nests that look like cups, right? Like that little like hummingbird friend. Nice things that look like this. But we'll also sometimes build domes. So we'll take a cup and put a roof on it. And we'll also sometimes build platforms. So just a base and not bother to put anything on the sides. It's not a subspecies thing. It's, as far as we know, not a geographic thing. It's just variation within the species. And this is a problem for those phylogenetic imperative methods that I mentioned, because a lot of them make the assumption that it is one species, one behavior. The moment you have one species, multiple behaviors, a lot of the mathematics breaks. And then the question is, what do we do in that case? The answer often ends up being like panic tears. So that's a problem, and also possible responsible for some of these different results that we're getting from a bunch of different studies. And then a third possible reason for why these different studies are getting so many different results has to do with the fact that birds don't realize that they're supposed to build nests into categories that people like me like. So this is a cacique nest, yellow-rumped cacique, neotropical icterid, so blackbird-like thing. What kind of nest is that? So it's kind of like a cup in that it has a well-defined base and walls, and it doesn't actually have a roof. But it's also kind of not a cup in the sense that if you're thinking about the amount of protection that this nest might provide, it seems to provide a lot of protection, right? Like it's probably harder to get into that than it is to get into a little cup like this. So what do we call that? Do we call it a purse? Is that a new category? A new cacique only category? Do we call it a cup? Do we call it both a cup and a dome? Do we omit it from our studies? There was a time in my life when I was having a lot of meetings looking at pictures like that and trying to figure out what was going on. So the lack of clear categories can also cause a lot of problems. And when researchers interpret nests like this in different ways, they will then sometimes get very different results. All of the problems on this screen are at least partially solvable, right? I am never going to know what kind of nest a mysterious starling built, but we can get more data, we can think more smartly about the methods, and we can maybe think about the fact that birds don't build their nests in nice, neat categories. So to address some of these things, I led a team of researchers based out of St. Andrews, Bristol, and Durham to try to build up a data set of nest traits for the world's birds that would be of maximal usage to the community. We mostly got them from written records, mostly in English, a little bit in Spanish and Portuguese, but mostly in English, mostly from the Handbook of the Birds of the World, which these days is Birds of the World Online. And we were just trying to collate what data there was and put it together into a resource that we and others could use. So we thought a lot about how we should code structures, right? Because at the end of the day, you do in fact need categories in order to analyze them. But then in addition to having categories like this that think about things like, does it have a roof or not? And do they put it in a cavity or not? We also included a tremendous number of expert notes about what other things these birds are doing, as well as the original text descriptions we're basing it on. So someone else could go into our data set and say, hey, I don't like the way they coded purses. I'm going to code that a different way. That should be doable from our data set. We also thought about the location the birds put their nests. This is in some sense a lot easier because, right, they either put it on the ground or they don't, but is also in another sense harder because it turns out that birds within a particular species will often put their nests all sorts of places, huge amount of flexibility there. And while we're at it, we collected a whole bunch of other information that we thought might be relevant to researchers about nests with varying levels of success. So like, how big is the nest and what is it made out of and which parent built the nest and how long did it take to build them? We only know how long it took to build them for like 7% of species, but hey, for those species, we have that coded these days. And then also we recorded nest height. So minimum, maximum, and average of how high these nests tend to be, because that's often used as a proxy about that predation variable, right? We know that measuring predation is very hard, but then there's maybe the sense that if you're a nest on the ground, you're more accessible to predators than if you're a nest that's 100 meters up. Is that perfect? No, of course it's not, but it's one way to at least approach this question. Okay. We have data. I'm going to drink water and you can gaze upon this nest and think about all the data we have. Okay. We have data. We also had methods that could control for our buddies like this crake. So this is controlling for the fact that some species build multiple types of nests. I'm not going to include the math behind this, but if this is your jam, come talk to me during the drinks reception. We could then ask the question of if these differences in nest types correlated with the environment, and they did not. They did not so spectacular that I'm not even going to show you a graph. They just didn't. Instead, we found something else. So instead, the types of nests that birds build correlate with their morphology, correlate with what the birds look like. So these axes are on the x-axis, that's different types of nests. Dome tube is these dome nests with roofs and then an entrance tube. Whether you think that's different from a dome is a matter of philosophy. For the purpose of this graph, we're calling it different. X here is excavation, so that's the bird creating its own cavity. And then on the y-axis is the body mass of the species on a log scale. And what these little dots and hashes means are categories for which there's a statistically significant result that birds that build that type of nest have a different body size than expected. So the birds that build domes, for example, so the little blue hash, are smaller than expected after you control for everything else, whereas birds that build platforms and scrapes, this is a scrape, a platform is just a bed, no sides, are bigger than expected after you control for everything else. Maybe this makes sense to you because you've spent a lot of time looking at birds, but at least we have some sort of correlation here. Our models are not broken, for example. Body mass also correlates with the location of where the birds build the nest. So again, the blue hash means that the birds are smaller on average. So if you put your nest in vegetation, you were smaller than expected by chance. And if you put your nests in either artificial locations, so that's like things like you nest on someone's roof or like on a telephone pole or something, or on rocks and cliffs, you are larger than expected. Again, maybe this makes sense to you, but found something's correlated with nests, not a fully null result. But then we also found something even weirder about morphology. So this one's going to take a second to explain. Okay, so on the x-axis, again, we have different structures, different locations. And on the y-axis this time, we have something called the hand wing index. So this is a proxy of a measurement of how pointy a bird's wing is. It's a proxy for efficient flight. So this Arctic tern here has very pointy wings, is very well adapted for efficient long distance flight. This ruffed grouse here has really short stubby wings, not pointed at all, does not do long distance flight particularly well. So the Arctic tern will have a high hand wing index. The ruffed grouse has a low hand wing index. And the reason we included this model had to do with something we're testing about migration that turned out not to be true at all. But instead we're getting very strong correlations between this index of flight ability and the type of nests that the birds are building. And sadly, I don't have a punchline beyond this. These do not intrinsically make sense to me the way the sort of body mass ones did. And this is an area of active research in the lab and trying to figure out what this might be, what this might mean. Luckily, this was a data paper, so we didn't really have to explain ourselves beyond this, other than be like, hey, we found a really cool correlation. Someone else figure it out, please. Something going on, either flight itself or flight is often closely related to life history. So maybe it's related to life history in some way that we are just aren't clever enough to figure out yet. But here we go. Bird nests, as classified this way, are related to morphology. They aren't related to the environment. So cool, we have an answer. Maybe not the satisfying answer you were looking for, but it is an answer. So at this point, I think we should take a step back and think about why were we asking this question at all? And there's sort of two main reasons why questions like this matter. The first is an extremely practical one, right? You have probably seen graphs like this a lot recently, especially if you're on like climate social media. We are in crisis mode in terms of climate change, and the more that we know about different species behaviors and how they respond to temperature and how well they can deal with perturbations in temperature, the better we will be able to make conservation decisions right here, right now in the year 2024. But the reason why we do this on a slightly less scary sort of blue skies reason has to do with a big evolutionary biology question and involves taking a very big step back and thinking about birds in general. So I used to be able to say that there are about 10,000 species of birds, which was great because that was a lovely round number. There's not, there's like 11,000 species of birds. But regardless, there's a lot of birds, and they are divided up into something like 37 orders, plus minus a lot. And an order is a taxonomic grouping, right? Kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. Birds themselves are a class. So the next category down is orders. And if they are not, and they are not divided evenly into those 37 orders. Instead, about 60% of those 11,000 species fall into one order, which is the passerines, also known as passeriforms, Latin for perching. These are perching birds. They have feet that look like this. They have radiated a lot in terms of color, have radiated a lot in terms of song, and they are small, and there are a lot of them. And a big unanswered and kind of unanswerable question is, why are there so many passerines, right? Why is 60% of the avian diversity all found itself in one order rather than being evenly spread out among all 37 of them? A whole bunch of different reasons for why that might be, but a really intriguing possibility has to do with nests. So this was an idea put forth by Elsie Callias, who's the scientist on the right. She was an ornithologist at UCLA, and her husband, Nick Callias, and it had to do with the nests that passerines build. So a lot of passerines build these cup nests that I keep talking about. And I mean, think about a cup nest. We just said they're not related to the environment, but I mean, they probably provide some sort of protection, and they are things that the birds are building themselves. So they're pretty portable. You can probably build a cup nest a lot of places. Cool. The things that are more closely related to passerines tend to, instead of building cup nests, they instead nest in cavities. So they either find a natural cavity that's suitable, or they create one themselves. This is kind of evolutionary speaking, a silly thing to do, right? If you are excavating a nest yourself, you need a lot of really specialized behaviors and specialized morphological adaptations to do that, to create that nest. And whereas if you are trying to find a natural cavity, you have to spend a lot of time and energy defending it from other birds who also want to nest in that cavity. And suddenly all of your reproduction is about this, tying you perhaps to a particular place or a particular species of tree, something like that. This has all sorts of potential repercussions, like, for example, if your favorite species of tree goes extinct, then you're in trouble. Or it also makes you less likely to, explore around, can you survive the next valley over where there's fewer appropriate nesting sites for you? No, you can't. Whereas the idea being that if you can make this nice sort of protective cup nest, yeah, you can do that in the next valley over, that's fine. Gives you more chance for speciation. If speciation is going to occur between those two valleys, say, makes you less vulnerable to extinction if like a volcano goes off and kills your first valley. Now that explains passerines, we kind of don't know, because the radiation of the passerines kind of happened only once. Sample size of n equals 1, not something we can rigorously test. So if we're going to approach this idea, we're going to have to concentrate on something else. So that brings us to a suborder of the passerines called the tyrannids, the tyrannida. So these are the tyrant flycatchers found in Central and South America. There's a lot of them, even by passerine standards. Sorry, just keeping an eye on time. And They're notable for many reasons, but in particular, they're notable because they have diversified into a bunch of different habitats, and because they build a bunch of different types of nests. Some of them build cup nests, some of them build dome nests, so these nests with a roof. There seems to be a lot of switching back and forth between cup nests and dome nests. And while it's not as compelling an argument as this cavity versus not cavity, you can still make the argument that building a dome requires more energy, requires more specialized materials and architecture, requires more knowledge that may tie you to a specific spot, whereas again, a cup might be more portable. But is this actually true? So this is a paper published last year led by David Ocampo, who's a PhD student at Princeton, where we tested this very idea. So again, we used phylogenetic comparative methods, traced back the evolutionary history of switches between cups and domes, and then tried to figure out if this can be tied to things that may have to do with this idea of speciation, with this idea of exploring new habitats. So the very first thing that we tried was just habitat at the level of forest, not forest. Yes, no. Phylogenetic comparative methods with binary variables are very, very easy. So just cup, dome, forest, not forest. Yes, no, are they related? There's tons of switching back and forth between nest types, tons of switching back and forth between forests. They're not related at all, no correlation. Okay, fine. Forest versus not forest is very silly. So let's try this with continuous measures of climate. So this is things like temperature and annual variation in temperature, precipitation, annual variation, precipitation, NDVI, so the amount of vegetation. Throw all of those into a model. Are they correlated? Nah. Okay. What about something that we're actually interested in? What about range size? So I'm, throwing out kind of ideas about like speciation and what is that? Hard to tell. But range sizes we can measure, right? We have this idea that if building a cup means it's very flexible, that probably means you can live in a bigger range of habitats, more places than this very specialized domes. So are these switches between cups and domes related to variation in range size? Nope, they just aren't. So there's clearly something cool going on in the Tyrannida that meant that they have radiated out and exploring a bunch of different environments. Also, something is presumably causing these switches back and forth between cups and domes, but they don't seem to be related. And so our awesome, cool idea about if we can explain bird diversity because of variation in the nests that they build, science are pointing to no. We haven't directly tested this, basically because it's hard, because the maths are very hard, but we're building up evidence that maybe this isn't the right question to be asking about avian biodiversity in general. You can drink water again, and you can gaze at a slightly different nest this time. Okay. So I've been talking a lot about the structure of a nest, right? I've been using words like cup to describe this nest. And I sort of, laughingly said, okay, yeah, birds don't realize that they're supposed to be building a cup, but like, what if that's actually the case? What if thinking about the structure of the nest in terms of words like cup and dome are actually the wrong things to be measuring? What if we think about other types of properties of what nests can be? And this is where Douglas Russell gets very nervous, but that's okay. So nests also come in sizes, right? They are physical objects with physical dimensions, and those dimensions might vary. And we know for some species that within the species, individuals that live in very cold climates build bigger nests than individuals that live in very warm climates, right? This idea being that a bigger, like fluffier, better insulated nest will do well in the cold. And then if you need to dissipate heat very quickly, or if the body heat of the incubating parent is enough to get to that beautiful, perfect 38 degrees, time when no British people need to talk about the weather, then that will suffice. And the question is, does this variation within a species translate to variation between species? Because of course, between species. Some species build bigger nests than other species. So we have a climate question, but it's not about nest structure anymore. We're thinking about the dimensions of nests. So this was work that was led by my former PhD student, Karina Venetsina, who is now a postdoc at the University of Warsaw. We specifically looked at passerine nests, and we specifically look at cup nests. The reason for cup nests is because you can understand kind of how to measure a cup nest, like that kind of makes sense. It's much harder to think about how to measure a dome nest or like a platform or something in the cavity. The logistics are just harder. And then thinking about it in terms of passerines was mostly for logistical reasons. We couldn't possibly do all birds. We got a lot of data from the Handbook of the Birds of the World. Karina and I went through, and anytime anyone reported nests that they had measured, we got those. Thank you very much. And then Karina went down to the Natural History Museum at Tring, and we're very kindly permitted to measure physical nests there. We're interested in the effect of temperature on these nests. So does temperature relate to the sizes of nests between species? But of course, you have to control for other stuff as well. Bigger birds build bigger nests. On the one hand, no duh. On the other hand, finding a citation for that was actually very hard. Most people just kind of assume that and then go about them right away. Apologies for the snake again. We again had to think about predation. So in this case, we use nest height, as I alluded to earlier, as one possible proxy for predation. We also used whether or not the birds breed on islands or not as one possible proxy getting at predation, with there being fewer nest predators on islands than there are in the mainland. And then finally, we had to think about the fact nests are used in sexual selection in some species. There are some species where the male will build this really big, really awesome, fancy nest as a way of advertising to the female that she should mate with him because look at his awesome nest. He's clearly going to be a great parent. That's awesome. It's a really cool system that I wish I knew more about, but not really relevant for this question of does temperature relate to the size of bird nests? So we had to filter all of that out. So again, using phylogenetic comparative methods, so tracing back to evolutionary history and controlling for all the things that you control for, we finally got a positive answer, right? We finally got the answer that yes, temperature is related to bird size, is related to nest size. So birds that nest in cold places build bigger nests after you control for all this other stuff. Whereas birds that nest in warm places build on average smaller nests after you control for all of this other stuff. Finally, we found some things to do with climate. We won, right? We've won. And then finally, so for the last bit of my talk, I'm going to concentrate on another one of these aspects that's moving beyond the sort of broad categorization of nests. Again, thinking of like the physical, like nests as a physical artifact, a thing that you can see in front of you. And that is thinking about the fact that nests need to be made out of something, right? You have a nest in front of you, and that is going to be made out of things. And if you've ever watched a bird build a nest, you'll notice that they mostly use their beak to do that building. They pick up the materials with their beaks, they then fly over, they place the materials with their beaks, they sometimes like wiggle their bodies a little bit, and maybe use their feet, but it seems to be mostly an object manipulation question with their bills. So do these bills play any role in what's going on? Right, birds are using a lot of different materials to build their nests. These materials are going to vary between species. There's some species that are very particular about their materials. There's some species that aren't, just kind of put anything in their nest. And if you think about the different shapes and sizes that bills can be, it might seem just like biomechanically that some will be better than others at either manipulating materials or transporting them in some way. So to think about the relationship between the biomechanics of bills and then the nest materials, I worked with Shoko Sugasawa, who's now at Newcastle University. and she specializes in bird nests in the lab, so with zebra finches, and then also in the wild, so working with swallows in Japan, and thinks a lot about how like physical, real live birds actually build nests, which is cool. Real birds, they're great. But then we thought about if what the patterns that she was noticing in her zebbies and in her swallows could be extrapolated across all species of birds. So for just under 7,000 species of birds, we were able to get together lists of materials that have been found in their nests. We're able to classify them into categories that seemed biomechanically relevant. And then we started thinking about if these classifications of materials were relevant to beak size and shape using data from AvoNet, which is where my PhD data ended up from Tring, as my introduction alluded to. Okay. So these are morphospaces of beak measurements. This is a lot. Let me walk through what you're looking at. So if you're measuring beaks, a lot of the measurements are going to be correlated with each other, right? Like a big beak is going to have a big length and a big width and a big depth. So instead of just saying the same thing over and over and over again, what you do is you do something called a principal components analysis, which basically turns all of your measurements into a theoretical morphospace. So instead of saying like beak length over here and beak depth over here, you instead say like nonsense variable of variation here and another nonsense variable of variation here. Either you're following me or I've totally lost you. That's okay. That's fine. The idea here being is that you have this like theoretical space, and if you have, and each species is a point in that space, and if the species are close together in the space, they have very similar beaks, and if the species are far apart in that space, they have different beaks, right? What you're looking at in the X and Y axes are the first two components of that space. There are more, they are secret. And then we have colored each of these species by the different types of materials that they use, okay? If beak size and shape were related to nest materials, we would expect to see clumps of color, okay? I know this figure is small, but you can kind of stare at that and you can ask the question of, do you see clumps of color? And like, maybe you see clumps of color. It's not super clear. It's not super clear because there's like a secret 5 other dimensions back here. It's also not super clear because we have to do that fancy statistics thing and control for the fact that these data points aren't independent. It's also not super clear because birds use their beaks for other things that we have to control for, like diet and foraging, and the fact that the environment is probably related to beaks somehow and also probably related to material availability somehow. Okay. Probably sounds like a lot. It is a lot. So we had to use something called random forest models, which are a type of machine learning algorithm, which I then had to basically recode to account for phylogeny as well, to basically ask, are these clusters meaningful? And we got 2 answers from that. First answer is yes, these clusters are super meaningful. Our machine learning algorithms can predict what materials a bird will use with like stupidly good percentage of success, like in some cases like 94% success. So answer 1. Answer 2 is that that's actually a lie. Our robot overlords are not that good yet. Basically what's happening is that the machine learning algorithms are figuring out this phylogeny using the data that we give it, and it's then making guesses based on what birds are related to each other, and it's very, very good at doing that. It's also very good at doing silly things like, if it doesn't know, it'll guess the most popular material and not guess the rare materials. So you have to like penalize the model so it stops doing that. And once you do that, you still get a correlation. Okay, that correlation is there. It's statistically significant, but it's like 2%, 2% good. Some of you may come from fields of science where 2% is great. Some of you come from fields of science where 2% is awful. I tend to think of this mostly as we've learned something really important about how machine learning algorithms work, and we should maybe be suspicious of people like me who use them because they often lie to you. Okay, I think I have about 5 minutes left, maybe. And so with that 5 minutes, I'm going to say one final thing about nest materials. And that has to do with a very specific type of materials, which is anthropogenic or man-made materials. In the past few years, we have noticed a whole lot of bird nests using anthropogenic materials, especially plastics, especially seabirds. In 1924, which was the first report in English-speaking Western science of a bird using an anthropogenic material in its nest, it was a pied crow using a bit of wire in its nest. It was a Nature paper. It was a real big deal. It was like, oh, cool. Crow nest, wire, awesome. Now it seems like every week there's a really sobering report of someone who is out surveying seabirds and saying like, oh yeah, 100% of this year's nests have plastic in them, guys. That's probably pretty bad. It's probably pretty bad because birds get tangled in the plastic, especially chicks, and they're strangled. It's bad because the birds eat the plastic. This is a lot of work that's being done out of training with Alex Bond, just showing how really terrible that is for birds when they eat plastic waste. There's also some types of human waste that poisons birds, especially chicks. So there's a series of studies done about 10 years ago in Mexico City looking at cigarette butts. And on the one hand, cigarette butts are kind of cool because they chase away the parasites, but they're also genotoxic and cause all sorts of problems for the chicks down the line. But the thing is, other than these incidental reports from the fields of like, oh no, there's so much plastic in seabirds, we don't really know which birds are and are not incorporating man-made materials into their nests. Because as I mentioned very briefly earlier, there's some species that are very particular in the materials that they use. They have their favorite type of moss. They are only using their favorite type of moss, and nothing will stop them from using their favorite type of moss. And then there's other species of birds that will just kind of use any old thing. And we don't have a good sense of what that variation is or what might be causing that. So using that same list or set of lists of nest materials for just under 7,000 species, I and an undergrad at the time, Lucy Stott, went through and looked for evidence of man-made material in these nests, and then tried to figure out which species were and were not using them. We found a number of correlates, some of which may be fairly obvious to you, some of which may surprise you. The first being rather straightforward, that it has a lot to do with how well the birds are monitored. If there are species of birds that we just know a lot about their breeding in general, we are more likely to have found anthropogenic materials in their nests versus the species of birds where it's like, yeah, someone found a nest once in like 1974 and it was made out of moss, and that's all we know about it. Right, there is variation there, and that has a lot to do with whether or not we're even detecting this pattern. Has a lot to do with how closely the birds are breeding in human modified landscapes. So things like cities, but also farmland. Some birds tolerate that pretty well. Some birds don't. And the birds that are breeding in these modified landscapes are more likely to be incorporating human materials in their nests. There's also the specific question of, never mind, like, are they in cities or not, but specifically, will they put their nests in artificial locations? Will they nest on roofs? Will they nest on telephone poles? Will they nest on piers? And even after controlling for these other two things, the ones that seem willing to tolerate human locations for their nests, more likely to use anthropogenic material. And then finally, there seems to be this element of sort of what I was calling cognitive flexibility. And Sue Healy was yelling at me every time I was saying that, because there is this underlying sense that some birds will only use one or two types of materials in their nests, even the really well-studied ones. And then some birds, their list of possible nest materials are like miles and miles and miles long. And even after controlling for everything else that we could think to control for, the ones who seem to be able to, for whatever reason, incorporate a lot of materials in their nests are more likely to be using these man-made materials, whereas the ones with their favorite type of moss, sticking with the favorite type of moss and not touching the plastic. This is a really sobering note to end on. But also, I think in some ways it's a little bit hopeful, right? I was throwing some blue skies evolution at you. I think that's exciting. Hopefully some of you think that that's exciting, but this blue skies evolution also has practical applications for today. So we can figure out what birds are doing with their nests and then hopefully make sensible decisions for the years ahead. So with that, I hope you've enjoyed thinking about what happens when the weather gets a little strange. I hope you don't mind that I mocked the Brits a little bit. I'd like to thank all of my colleagues and co-authors on the various projects and the funding sources. Also Tring for letting me play both with their skins and also for letting me send a student to measure a whole bunch of nests. I'm incredibly grateful for you all for listening, and I'll gladly take any questions. Thank you.